Pullman's office was atop the 10-story Pullman building, a skyscraper in downtown Chicago. The busiest, most concentrated business district in America. When a visitor from China first saw it, he was appalled.
And he says that he almost froze up when he got off the train and entered the city. The L system's up, and it's roaring overhead like crazy. This swirling smoke in the city, this soot coming off the street, this cloud of smoke hanging over the city, the rush of people, this cavalry charge on the streets, streetcar lines all over the place, trolleys going along. Let's say there's a dray in front of it with 4 horses. They just pick it up and push it to the side. Horse and team spin over like that. Peddlers on every corner. The circus is in town. Elephants down the street, clowns, big animals shitting on the street, lions and tigers, skyscrapers going up, a story every 3 days, and there's spectacles in the sky, and people are watching like urban shows, watching these buildings going up. The sound of rivet guns, which are just invented at the time, bang, 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 of the rivet systems. Lots of immigrants who came to the city went downtown for the first time and just couldn't believe the spectacle. It just seemed like one vast construction site.
The congestion was due in part to the L, the elevated transit that brought people downtown from all parts of the city. By 1900, Chicago had the best urban transit system in the world. 20 years earlier, it was a mess. It took longer to get downtown in 1882 by a horse car than to Milwaukee by train. The genius behind these changes was Charles Tyson Yerkes. Yerkes had done time in Philly for embezzlement and would leave Chicago the most vilified public figure in its history.
He was this big, corpulent, handsome man, very arrogant, and made it known to Chicagoans that he said, this place is a hellhole, and I'm going to live here for a while and make $1 million, and I'm going back to where I can live regally and well in New York.
In 1882, just after Yerkes arrived, Chicago opened its first cable car line. Marshall Field invested in cable cars that headed for his store, looped around, and headed back south. Since then, the loop has been synonymous with downtown Chicago. The rest of the city had horse cars. Backed by Philadelphia cohorts, Yerkes consolidated these private transit lines and replaced horse cars with cable cars. He cleaned up 2 water-soaked tunnels under the river to avoid the delay of swing bridges. He introduced electric trolleys and then elevated them. But no one liked him.
He's always been seen as a monster in Chicago because he was imperious. Yerkes liked to run small trains as opposed to larger trains. Asked why, wouldn't it be better if you provided the customers with more amenities? His response was, why should I? It's the strap hanger who provides me my margin of profit.
Yerkes was also a crook. He built his North Chicago cable line for $3 million, charged stockholders $10 million, and split $7 million with his Philadelphia partners. Late in the century, he bribed state and city legislators to pass a bill giving him a 50-year monopoly. That was too much, even for a city of hustlers. Mobs stormed the council chambers, and the Goliath of graft was hounded out of Chicago. Charles Tyson Yerkes had made $15 million in Chicago. He went to London and built its famous underground. In the 1880s and 90s, developers rebuilt Chicago's downtown for the second time since the fire. In their pursuit of money, they created not only the world's first skyscraper city, but a unique American architectural style. The Loop was hemmed in by Lake Michigan on the east, the river on the north, the South Branch on the west, and railroads to the south. There was nowhere to go but up.
You have a grid in a flat plane. You tilt it up into space as a matrix. All by itself. That's wildly authoritative. It's very powerful. So even now when you fly in on a plane and you see the prairie and the lake, this tabula rasa, you see this almost oasis coming out of nowhere that is a grid in plan and a grid in elevation. That's wild. That's the aesthetic that transpired as a result of that fire.
Improvements in elevators and the creation of structural steel made skyscrapers possible.
They're built because space constraints, yes, but they're built because they're very efficient, an efficient way to organize a business organization. You have an internal mail system within the skyscraper. Contiguous firms, firms associated with one another, printers would hang out with lawyers, copying people. So there is literally this business city under one roof.
What the real estate people wanted was somebody who could get the building up fast, on schedule, on cost, and you could start collecting rent. And if the architects were able to create something creative in the process, well, that was just icing on the cake.
Peter Brooks from Boston wanted to make a buck in Chicago real estate. He hired the Chicago architectural firm Burnham and Root.
There were letters that went back and forth between Boston and Chicago, where Burnham and Root would propose ornamental details, and in a good sense of hard-headed practicality, the Brookses would say, I don't want that kind of detail, I don't want to pay for it, it's something that birds are going to sit on and foul the building, it's not necessary at all. And they kept goading the architects.
Clean it up, strip it down, make it more functional, make it less expensive. At the same time, Root is coming to a new appreciation of simplicity and saying that this is the new American style. This is a business city. These are the kinds of buildings that should be built for commerce with simplicity, strength, durability, handsomeness. Root says at one point, there's nothing more beautiful than a plain brown wall.
In the case of the Monadnock building, they got a building of such direct and beautiful simplicity that you could actually say that the client had a hand in creating it, and a masterpiece was the result.
Fearing people would be intimidated by the height that structural steel allowed, some architects tried to disguise it by groups of windows separated by moldings. Buildings appeared to be 2 or 3 stories stacked one on top of the other. Lewis Henry Sullivan was not so constrained.
There were people like Louis Sullivan, the dreamer, the poet of Chicago architecture, somebody who really held deep, passionate ideals about what architecture was all about and what it could be, who really looked at the skyscraper and said, well, this is a new kind of building. Why make a building look like a lot of little buildings stacked on top of each other? Why not let the building soar and let the sheer height become a thing of beauty?
Sullivan's department store, the Carson Peary Scott Building on State Street, was considered a business and aesthetic triumph.
Clad columns, clad for fireproofing because of the fire. But basically, 90% certainly glass. An all-glass ground floor that you could walk in. That had never happened before, that you could actually see into the store. You could walk down the street and say, that's great, and walk in and buy it right then and there. That's unheard of.
Sullivan's architectural credo was form follows function. This did not mean sterile facades. He delighted in decorative detail on the ground floors, which people could enjoy. Chicago developers did not skimp on money for public spaces. The spacious lobby of the Rookery Building enticed clients. A soaring glass ceiling let in light in an age before decent electric lights. The entire building was designed to let light into the offices of businessmen and their clerks and typists. Light poured into the largely glass facade of the Reliance Building. Rain cleaned its glazed columns like a plate to save on maintenance.
All this stuff still was at the service of capital, period. Business, raw business, unsullied, just business.
Standing in the shadows of the Loop in the late 19th century, few were aware that their city of stone and steel was built during the very years the pine forest of Michigan and Wisconsin vanished. The transformation of an ecosystem into a city was, to the few who noticed, a sign of progress. No trains passed through Chicago. They all stopped at the edge of the Loop.
There used to be a joke about that. A lady went to the conductor and said, "Does this train stop in Chicago?" And the conductor said, "Lady, if it doesn't stop in Chicago, there's going to be an awful crash." Because the idea was they wanted the trains to come here. You would have to get off the train, stay at the Palmer House, and shop at Marshall Field's store, and then the next day go out on the other train. And it was all set up that way. And that promoted the business community.
The business community centered on State Street. Potter Palmer had come to Chicago to create a market for the few women shoppers he observed in the 1850s. By the 1890s, almost all the shoppers on State Street were women. The premier store was Marshall Field's.
Field wasn't just selling you a communion suit for your son at a very important moment. He was also selling you a slice of the good life, a slice of the upper echelons of Chicago society. If you bought European gloves, which were produced exclusively for Fields, you were also getting a taste of European cultural history and a bit of, old money brought to a town that was made up completely of new money. He understood instinctively that when people purchased things, they were buying a bit of their own ambitions for themselves. And by making Fields a kind of palace of consumption, he was instilling his brand with a very, very important element of social legitimacy.
At age 17, Marshall Field had taken a job as a